Zoltan Chivay, a jolly dwarf from all appearances, did not spend a lot of his time in Mahakam, the dwarven capital of the world these days, as Zoltan didn't like Mahakam. He found that Brouwer Hoog, the elder of Mahakam, was only interested in making money and terribly inconvenient laws. So, Zoltan decided to leave for the human cities, specifically Sintra. Of course, Sintra wasn't necessarily a safe place to stay for very long, given the Nilfgaardian interest in the place. So the dwarf eventually found himself joining a group of friends on the road. Or, well, maybe group of friends is a bit of a stretch. It was more of a gang to begin with. This gang, consisting of Zoltan Chivay and his extremely foul-mouthed parrot called Field Marshal Duda, Munro Bruis, Jezen Varda, Caleb Stretton, Figgis Merluzzo, and Percival Schuttenbach, the only gnome in this party of dwarves, decided that a bit of robbery was not beneath them. Just outside Dillingen, they attacked a rather wealthy merchant who himself was attempting to run from the war, which was ironic because the merchant had gotten rich as a hawker himself. They took his gold and jewels, possibly killing the man in the process, then fled Dillingen towards Bruges, taking a route through the forest most days to avoid the armies and the stream of refugees. As they traveled on, they ran into refugees often enough, even taking some women and children under their protection, perhaps to soothe their conscience. When they eventually crept out of the woods to march on the main road, singing a hearty song about a wolf who set to marry, they're surprised to hear an answer to their song from none other than Dandelion. The dwarven gang had ran into Geralt's group. Zoltan decided that they must be friends, for they answered a song with a song. As they seemed to get along well enough, the dwarf offered to travel alongside Geralt, although he acknowledged that they'd move slowly because of the refugees that walked with them. He simply refused to leave them behind, even though the women themselves disliked the dwarves greatly, calling them all sorts of things behind their back. But Geralt and his group agreed to march together, and so, after the dwarves had looted some nearby corpses, they were on their way, pulling along a cart they'd picked up on the side of the road as well. It soon became apparent that the dwarves were not exactly of the sensitive kind. They didn't use horses to pull the cart. No, the dwarves pulled said cart themselves, because they were better at it. And when Milva brought up that their horses might have split hooves soon, Zoltan immediately commented that he was great at roasting horse meat. They also didn't bother going out into the bushes to do their business, so to speak. And they farted and cursed loudly day in, day out, at least until Milva told them off. First nicely, and when Zoltan didn't want to listen, she instead unleashed a rich torrent of abuse on the dwarves with several very specific threats, which finally had the desired effect. From then on, they all obediently went into the bushes. Another odd quirk was that when they ran out of food, some of Zoltan's group would simply leave to rob some nearby fugitives. Yes, other fugitives, because as Zoltan put it, he could only do very specific good. Good that wouldn't go to waste. He couldn't be good to everyone, that's just too much. So he decided he would be good to himself and his immediate circle. Geralt decided not to ask too many questions. And so they traveled on, playing complicated dwarven card games, occasionally fending off a monster. During said monster fight, Zoltan also let slip that he was very much aware that Geralt was a witcher, even though he tried to hide it. Dandelion wasn't very good at hiding, you see, and had told the dwarves all about their group and their quest, but Zoltan didn't seem fazed. In fact, they bonded over swords not long after. Zoltan owned a beautiful sihil, an expertly crafted blade, so sharp one could almost shave with it. It was engraved with an ancient dwarven incantation that roughly translated to "Death to the motherfuckers." Geralt was certainly impressed, though a little less impressed when Zoltan and Percival started making fun of his lack of knowledge on swordsmithing. It wasn't long before they finally came across apparent civilization, a small house that smelled of food. But when some of the dwarves went to investigate, it turned out that the house was infested by smallpox. Only one girl wasn't infected herself somehow, and she warned them to stay away, which they dutifully did. The bandits that showed up only moments later did not. They grabbed the girl by her hair and took her out of sight, leaving nothing but screams. Zoltan and his dwarves didn't rightly care to risk smallpox to save the lass, but Geralt thought differently. He was a witcher, after all, and he was also quite sick of sitting around and doing nothing. So, instead, Zoltan handed Geralt his sihil, and the witcher charged in, Milva backing him up with her bow and arrow. Zoltan even had a small change of heart by the end of the ensuing carnage, and jumped out to whack a bandit over the head with his axe. When the battle was over, Zoltan seemed more bothered that the girl didn't stop to thank them for their help, earning him a "thank us for what?" from Geralt and Milva. "For the bandits' horses," Zoltan answered. "She could eat them." They traveled on, with Zoltan complaining about how humans are selfish and childish, until eventually they had to make a choice on where to travel, through the woods or the main road. Geralt warned of ghouls in the forest. "Ghouls!" Zoltan Chivay said, retreating and spitting on the ground. "Flesh-eaters!" "Naturally, we have to beware in the forest at night."
Fucking hell!
Field Marshal Duda screeched. "You took the words right out of my mouth, birdie," Zoltan Chivay said, frowning. "Well, we're in a pretty pickle. What's it to be then? Into the forest, where there's ghouls? Or along the road, where there's armies and marauders?" They decided on the forest, where they almost immediately managed to drop their trusty wagon into a ravine. As it shattered at the bottom, Zoltan and his dwarves exchanged some knowing glances, knowing that their stolen loot was among the goods. A few of them thus stayed behind to bury their haul, as Zoltan and the rest carried on. And carry on they did, right into a cemetery where they met Regis the vampire. Except they didn't know he was a vampire yet, and so gladly accepted his invitation to join him for some extremely alcoholic drinks in his little house, causing Zoltan and Dandelion to fall asleep in each other's arms while snoring powerfully. The next day, they ran into a group of peasants hailing from a nearby refugee camp who insisted on stealing Milva's horse. Milva insisted that they did not, with her fist, and so they left the peasants behind, instead making their way to the refugee camp, where the women and children traveling with the group finally found their family again. One of the children even confronted Zoltan with all the terrible things their mother had said about them, noting that she didn't agree. She thought the dwarfs were very kind, to which Zoltan thought to give the little girl an emerald in return. An especially grand gift, as it wasn't long before Zoltan was foaming at the mouth with rage after finding out that everything in the refugee camp cost an absolute fortune, immediately falling back into another rant about how terrible humanity was and how they never managed to stick together. Dandelion protested and attempted to list some things dwarves had done, but he was drowned out by Zoltan and Percival making loud farting noises. And anyway, they were interrupted by the group of peasants that had tried to steal their horse earlier, now demanding recompense because the peasant Milva had socked in the face was a little out of it, and they couldn't marry him off anymore. Milva rejected their claims, and this rejection was enforced by a loud "Motherfucker!" from Field Marshal Duda and Zoltan tapping his axe. Geralt, not wanting to start a brawl, decided they should find the proper authorities and present their case. Unfortunately, the authorities were already embroiled in a witch trial that Geralt and the gang thought was ludicrous, and as such, they disproved all of the claims posed against the supposed witch, causing the priest that posed the claims in the first place to call Zoltan a heathen kobold and creature of darkness. As the proceedings proceed, however, the camp is attacked by a Nilfgaardian regiment, but before fleeing themselves, Zoltan, Percival, and the camp's proper authorities, shall we say, held down the priest and dropped a red-hot horseshoe down his pants. Unfortunately, Zoltan and his mates did get separated from Geralt's gang at this point, but they would meet again not long after. Zoltan had lost a friend in the struggle, Caleb Stratton, and they'd also picked up another group of defenseless women and children to protect. The dwarf had also managed to save the girl on trial for witchcraft. They travel on together again for a while, but given everything that had happened to the dwarves on the path, Zoltan decided that it was time to part once they neared the junction to Mahakam. Despite his earlier insistence of never returning, they were going home after all. As a parting gift, Zoltan gave Geralt his Sahil and confesses his thieving ways, thinking that Geralt wouldn't find him such an agreeable lad after that, but Geralt didn't care. He told the dwarf that he was a good man, and he'd like him to meet Ciri one day. A long while after, we find that Zoltan had joined the Mahakam volunteer army at the Battle of Brenna. Near the end of the fighting, when Nilfgaard had already lost, Zoltan and his dwarves were the ones to put an end entirely to Menno Cohorn, commander of the Nilfgaardian army, because they didn't understand a thing he was saying, and thus didn't care either way. Afterwards, Zoltan and his mates enjoyed a good beer and meal with Geralt in Rivia. He told Geralt that he wanted to set up a steam and water hammerworks in Novigrad, because there's too much competition in Mahakam, with his two friends, Figs and Browse. He'd sold Field Marshal Duda to Percival, who had opened a jewelry shop in Novigrad as well, where Duda now acts as a living advertisement. Zoltan was also hoping to marry in September to a lass named Eudora Breckenriggs. Geralt, meanwhile, noted he was giving up witchering and wished to return Zoltan's sigil to him, but Zoltan wouldn't have it back, so they decided to let the inn where they were eating have it instead. Unfortunately, it wouldn't stay here long, for a pogrom had begun. Zoltan himself did not want to hide in the cellar, but Geralt insisted, telling him to think of Eudora, and so off they went, while Geralt grabbed the sigil once more. Of course, the Witcher was cut down, only for the dwarves, including Zoltan, to run out and defend his dying body. Now, Zoltan would finally meet Ciri, although not in the way he'd hoped. After Ciri returned the Witcher to life, Zoltan helped carry Geralt into the boat, and that was that. We meet Zoltan again during The Witcher 1, where Geralt saves him from some racist thugs. The dwarf explains that he never got married because Zoltan wasn't rich enough, and his little endeavor in Novigrad failed. Now he played dice poker and sided with the Scoia'tael in their fight for freedom. During The Witcher 2, he continues said fight for freedom regardless of Geralt's choices, because he just can't abandon his brothers in arms, even though initially Geralt had to save him from being hanged in Flotsam when they figured out that he was working with the Scoia'tael. Later, during The Witcher 3, we find Zoltan rummaging around a tavern that was to be jointly ran by Dandelion and the dwarf. If only Dandelion wasn't missing at the time. Geralt and Zoltan go off to find Dandelion together and eventually also save the bard at last. Not that it would be the last fight for the dwarf, as he showed up to aid Geralt and his mates in their fight against the Wild Hunt, too. We can only hope that he might spend his final days retiring in the cozy inn, the Rosemary and Thyme.
I'm sure you're not surprised, but we're not doing skits at the end cards today either. I am so sorry. My Patreons are getting titles today. I hope you appreciate those too. Walguy the Illustrious, Robertson the Enlightened, Lochmoin the Fierce, MJ Coolsta the Impressive, Septic the Cattist, Mike Zweers the Unrelenting, Adrian Packle the Impeccable, Ray the Fortuitous, Freeman the Wise,